Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Deconstructor's Club podcast. We're excited to be able to be here with you and you with us. I am your host, Alex Weiss, and of course, with us, our co-host, Bob Azarito. And so, Bob, how has your day gone?
You're sounding better.
Am I?
Yeah.
Well,
you were
still dealing a little sniff with the sniffles, but I'm okay.
I'm doing great. I'm enjoying our series. I think countdown to the election. I mean, my goodness, so much is happening and getting so much drama happening right now. And people are nervous about what's going to happen.
It's interesting you're saying that because you kind of want to for me, that is, I'm kind of like avoiding the news a bit because it's just, overkill for me with the politics and everything that's going on. Right. But at the same time, I like to go to the comedy shows and
that helps a little bit. Yeah.
You get some news, but you laugh about things. But anyways, hey, we have an amazing guest today. And, without further ado, I want to introduce him to you. Kirt Lewis is a friend of mine. We've known each other for a number of years, and we were both evangelicals and leaders in this city and different, aspects. And I want him to talk about, what he did, when he was a city leader as an evangelical, and on top of that, give us some background because he deconstructed too for almost, the same reasons that I deconstructed. I mean, we had some differences, of course, but still there was some key things, that were interesting. And we're going to talk about that too. Some of those experiences, not pleasant at all. And it's good too, because I know there's several people that are listening to us or watching us that have deconstructed or are deconstructing, and maybe this is how they're being gaslit or how they're being treated. Just to let them know, hey, you're not alone. We've been through this, and in some ways, or in many ways, there is another side. You'll get to the other side, but it's still not an easy road. But we're going to talk about some of those things too. But without further ado, Kirt Lewis, good to have you here with us.
Thank you, my friend. Yeah, it's good to be here, and it's interesting. When you were just saying deconstruction, that's still ongoing. I remember a couple of years ago when I just started that process, when I left formal ministry and I started writing quite a bit, blogging just about my current questions and my struggles and my opinions, that actually connected with a former college friend who was local, and she's just been tracking all this stuff that I'm posting. She's like, can we get together for coffee? I just want to know what is happening. And I remember sitting down with her, and at one point in time, I really appreciated the question. She's like, well, what is it that you believe now? What is it? And I told her then, and I still believe this now, that my creed is the question mark. And so I feel like I'm just finally in a place where the universe is not a very tightly closed box of information that is prepackaged and handed to me to just accept or reject with consequences if you reject unpleasant ones, but rather one where now I get to just be curious about a lot of different things.
And isn't that the most difficult part about being raised in evangelicalism is that the concept of questioning was not acceptable. It wasn't welcomed. It wasn't encouraged. Yeah. And so a lot of times, if nothing else, we found that it was okay to question besides other conclusions we might come to. So that's really a very valid point for people listening in. They might, I kept most of my questions kind of private because I didn't want to get shamed by not being, confident and certain and that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it's clear whether it's spoken or it's articulated directly or the implications are there, that you're allowed to question within certain parameters, stay within the guardrails. But if you wander outside of those guardrails, it's either a failure of faith on your part or an act of rebellion, of sinful rebellion.
They start praying for you.
And
something wrong with you.
Something wrong with you. Got to bring this person back into certainty.
Which was definitely
you're getting lost.
I know, and I knew that those things were happening, especially after I left ministry and I started writing. That I was the subject of intense prayer on behalf of some individuals at church services. That Kirt is listening to, like literally listening to Satan. He is
you're being
rejecting
deceived.
the way. And especially somebody who was considered in his own part of the world, a leader in the evangelical Christian world here in the Sacramento region, particularly as it related to social compassion and justice. And we'll talk a little bit more about that and narrow it down. That the consequences, the judgment on me was even harsher, which has some biblical, backing, as it were. At least they would, there would be an appeal to Scripture that, for those who are, better that I go drown in a lake, than
stricter judgment,
than for me to, cause especially children, like my own children, like that was a big, that was just a grievous offense to some folks that I knew who I previously considered family and friends who just all of a sudden were no longer.
Forget all the offenses they caused. But anyways.
So, I thought maybe that it might be helpful just in terms of talking about deconstruction, that I wrote a piece on my blog just a few months ago, which was kind of an update of sorts. It was like where I'm at now, because I started doing a lot of writing in 2018 and 19, and then just kind of slowed down to kind of focus on myself, which was totally fine. It was actually not an act of sin for me to prioritize myself.
And that's interesting because that's what they say. You deconstruct because you just want to go live a life of sin.
Selfish, very selfish.
Yeah, you're
I was
being
told
selfish.
To question, to wrestle, to focus on my own health and well-being were actually acts of selfishness. And that makes sense because in my evangelical upbringing, it was very clear that self is something that is the last priority over the church, over family, over mission, and so forth. Like these are all the things that come first, and you are clearly way down the line.
And it's interesting. I was hearing today somebody say this, that I left evangelical Christianity actually because I wanted to be a better person.
Well, and I found that.
Because I wasn't that good of a person when I was.
Well, and I certainly wasn't a happy person.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I felt like in leaving, for me, in leaving my religious tradition and background and community, it was actually a point in which, from a standpoint of personal joy and happiness, I was experiencing a true born again experience.
Wow.
That I was like, so I had the joy of me for a while. I was like, wow, the joy of me, it really does exist. And I was finding it as far as feeling really authentically myself and not having to constantly curate my image and my reputation with individuals so that it would be honoring to them. And I was thinking it would be honoring to the Lord and all of those kind of things. But so a little bit of where I'm at now, it's kind of funny. I joke about like, well, it depends on what day of the week, if you ask me on a Monday, I'm probably going to be a nihilist, just like a lot of us are on Mondays, like just a nihilist / hedonist. I have some aspects of myself are very much fall in line with an atheistic, humanistic perspective. Other days I'm kind of agnostic. And then the last component that I refer to is that of being a poetic spiritualist, that I love. I still do honor and I'm finding real value, particularly in like more ancient and indigenous forms of spiritual expression that are very much grounded in kind of the world, the nature. It was funny. It was like I saw this meme the other day where it was showing like an 17th, 18th century like missionary, pointing at it, saw painting at some indigenous members of the indigenous community. It's like, if it weren't for us, you'd be worshiping the sun, and then the caption from the indigenous person, like, dude, the sun is real. Like, it's like, okay. Like, so, I find that in that there's, because I also love the arts. I'm a bit of a musician and I love poetry and those things. So I think that there's something beautiful about understanding our world and articulating in poetic ways. So I'm in a blender right now. So it often depends on the day. That's a little bit of kind of where I'm at.
Yeah,
in my
just to camp there for just 1 second, because I find that some of the indigenous spiritualities have a much greater appreciation for mystery, for things unknown, for things beyond our capacity to grasp. And there's a reverence almost for that aspect of humanity and the world and whatnot. And so, you know, the evangelicals for me always just took all the mystery out. It was just, oh yeah, it's just here, this, and you know, there was no question we didn't have an answer for at that time. And so this kind of an appreciation for mystery and for the unknown and for the beauty of expression. I mean, those things are better found outside of the evangelical system.
I'm a bit of a film buff. So if there is a movie that kind of matched my spiritual, psychological journey of leaving a high control, high demand religious environment, in this case, the brand being evangelical Christianity, and entering into that space that you're talking about, it would probably be The Truman Show with Jim Carrey from a number of years ago. And there's this classic scene where they're showing like a montage of him growing up, and he's like a kid in school, and they're like, what do you want to do when you grow up? And he's like, I want to be an explorer like Magellan. And she pulls down this map. She's like, a map of the world. She's like, oh, I'm sorry. They found everything. There's like, there's nothing left to explore. And in many ways, that was the world that I lived in within evangelical Christianity. So everything is packaged and handed to you.
You have to learn what's already been discovered.
It's really more about learning that and then learning to defend that. So that's where the idol of apologetics within evangelical Christianity is really kind of hilarious to me now in hindsight.
So many books, so many conferences of how to learn to defend your faith.
Well, I remember when I went to both Bible college and seminary and graduated from, at that time it was Multnomah Bible College. Now it's Multnomah University, and was in the last year actually bought out by William Jessup University. So it is now,
it
is now a satellite campus of William Jessup University. University here which is the largest region, Christian liberal arts university in Northern California, here in Sacramento region, which we have a lot of experience with. But I remember in both those institutions, it's interesting because as you get towards your final studies, there's usually like position papers, doctrinal position papers that you have to write. And it's interesting is because it's not about coming up really with your own thoughts on those doctrinal questions. It's literally that you're finding your own words to defend exactly what had been presented to you for the previous 2, 3, 4 years. And it just
because you got to keep up the status quo. You can't be wandering off into mysterious things.
So clearly there's a lot of freedom there. So that's kind of a little bit of where I'm at now. If you reverse engineer that going back, there was, I'd like kind of break it down into 3 separate chapters that I think really speak to my own deconstruction, especially as we talk about the subject of Christian nationalism. Is one, my childhood. So my parents, if you put this together, my dad came from a Methodist background. My mom came from the General Association of Regular Baptists. So hardcore fundamentalism, along with this squishy, more pliable, more liberal, if you want to call it that, form of Christianity in its day. And if you took like Methodism and Baptists, hardcore fundamentalist Baptists, you merge them together, you get evangelicalism basically of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so that's, my parents were born in 41. I was born in 74. So they kind of really I came into this world of conservative evangelicalism right at the rise of the religious right in the late 70s that helped usher in the election of Ronald Reagan in 80, his reelection in 84, Bush Sr.'s election in 92. And basically ever since then, it's been this hardcore alignment of evangelical Christianity, particularly I would say white evangelical Christianity, with a particular party, specifically the Republican Party, around a culture war mandate. And I grew up with that. And so I remember, basically we're going to go protest abortion. So here's a sign, kid,
carry it.
And sitting in San Rafael, California, along a busy street with a sign about like, don't kill babies. And like that was the world I grew up in. And it was very clear that the United States, along with the nation of Israel, were like two special, divinely established countries. And so my national identity was being fused with my spiritual or religious identity, which was basically Christian nationalism, which honestly has always been there from the beginning of American history, from that of European colonizers, the colonies. Like there's always been that infusion. The whole concept of manifest destiny, which justified the mass slaughter of indigenous communities and the enslavement of blacks predominantly from Africa. I mean, so Christian nationalism isn't really anything new. It's just like this is the newest expression, and it's taken on new levels of extremism in many cases, like we've seen January 6th. But that was, back in my childhood, that was kind of those formative years. Then the second chapter, and this is where Alex and I met, is I was pastoring here in the Sacramento area, been here since 2007, originally at an American Baptist church in Carmichael. And then eventually I started off to launch a church that just didn't take, but I connected eventually with the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church up in the northern part of Sacramento. And while I was there, that was just part-time, and I had connected with World Relief. World Relief is the evangelical arm of the National Association of Evangelicals ever since post-World War II. Largely, it was interesting. It was the evangelicals' world to mobilize a humanitarian aid specifically for war-torn Europe, for refugees. And so there was a deep connection from those early stages with World Relief as an organization to provide humanitarian relief for those who were displaced by war and violence. And World Relief would eventually become one of 9 at the time NGOs that had a cooperative agreement with the State Department to do refugee resettlement. And I saw this posting on Western Seminary's website, which was the other school I went to, saying that they were looking for a church mobilizer. So I came on staff part-time with them to start to mobilize churches to fulfill what I saw as a biblical mandate, both for compassion as well as a witness. That's what I was always taught, right? And so in that context, eventually I really kind of thrived in that role, and eventually served in a national position with World Relief as a senior specialist working with World Relief offices across the country to help them mobilize churches to welcome the stranger and the alien amongst us. And then eventually I became the director of the Sacramento field office. And around that time, there was a lot of effort. I think it's still going to this day, though I've honestly disconnected from it, but a lot of effort around our focus on unity here in the Sacramento region with the evangelical community. And a lot of that was focused on service as well as witness or evangelism. And so I kind of rose in my profile here in the area as a representative, a leader of a leading NGO, evangelical NGO, working with refugees and other vulnerable immigrant populations. And all that was in the wonderful years of the lead up to and the immediate aftermath of the election in 2016. So it was in that time that I started to feel very unsettled about a number of things related to Christian nationalism. And you know what? I just realized I totally skipped a chapter.
Yeah,
I did. I totally skipped a chapter. So let me do this. Let me like pause that.
It is important that you say important. That. It is.
Okay, so it is. Remember, I was deeply infused with Christian nationalistic identity as a childhood. one of the most profound ways that manifested itself in my life is, of course, we experienced 9/11 here in the United States. And that was really not just an attack on a country. It felt like an attack on our status as a national Christian, people, in essence, and all the mandates that come with that. I just know that my parents, my dad in particular, had some military history, and I felt very strongly post 9/11. It's like I feel like I need to serve, and it wasn't just to serve country. It's like God and country, as they say. I very much felt like me doing this was something that I felt God was leading me to do. So I
kind of
left
like a crusade.
ministry. Yeah. Some of it was my motivations were just because I cared about my country. I cared about people. I didn't want to see anybody attacked or hurt. And so if there was something I could do to defend, then I would do that. But it was still very strongly connected to this sense that that God was leading me to do this and many others to do this. So I left ministry for a few years, ended up serving active duty a couple of years, included a tour of duty in Iraq in 2003. And so that was that second chapter. But then eventually, years later, I would say that there was kind of chinks in the armor at that point, because my experience in Iraq was also very disheartening. It felt like a lot of the narrative that I had been told about why, that we are God's country and we don't make mistakes. We just represent him. It felt like that was falling apart, which could be honestly a whole story for another time, because it has to do with the specific mission of the team I was on.
I could only imagine.
Which was, I was on the primary unit that was responsible to look for WMDs, which
I was
the
going to
whole
say
justification for the war. So
I was about
that's
to ask
a
you
whole
that
other
question,
story for
but-
another time.
Wow. Yeah.
But it did feel like, it's like all of a sudden I left that experience. I thought it was going to be something where it felt like everything about it felt right and good. And then I left that experience very privately conflicted and feeling a lot of guilt and shame about what we were involved in. And that only grew over time as I saw the domino effect of how much destabilization that caused. In many ways, my motivation to connect and to work with refugees later was done out of a place of feeling like I needed to do something to
kind of balance it, correct it.
To correct a wrong
Yeah.
that I was personally involved in.
Wow.
And so that was what led to that motivation. But needless to say, when I started working with refugees, an issue, by the way, which was not politicized until the 2016 election.
Yes.
It was not an issue. It's ironic because there's some parallels between that and even the issue of abortion was not politicized, even amongst the Catholic Church.
Right.
Until it just was, until it was decided that it's like, this can be useful politically to mobilize people and to create, to pursue power and influence. So those are the kind of the three main chapters. And I saw, as I know Alex saw, particularly as a representative of a largely, of a congregation that was largely undocumented.
Yeah.
And I was working with predominantly Muslim refugees. And we went from being representatives, valued leaders with the evangelical community on how do we love and serve and reach out to both the undocumented and the refugee community, to as soon as we started challenging Christian nationalism, lost dozens, if not hundreds in various ways of relationships. It felt like overnight. And that began the process for me where I felt like, there's, at the end of the day, not only in terms of doctrine, but in terms of values and community, there was no longer enough alignment for me personally with evangelical Christianity. And I knew I needed out. So I left ministry and then eventually I left.
Hold that thought, because I want to go back to it. But I know that Trumpism was an exposure to the xenophobia that was already within the leadership that we were a part of. Yet beforehand, they didn't feel the boldness to actually say anything. I mean, there was some people on the fringes that would say some stuff, but you were like, but I feel secure where I'm at. I think the people here really trust who we represent or who we're serving. And then Trumpism kicks in, going up to the 2017 or 2016 elections, that is. And all of a sudden, all of this just starts coming out. And then when you start challenging, you get gaslit. And going to those experiences when you started asking questions, pushing back. I know you even did an interview in the radio one time. I was hearing your interview. Go ahead and share. I don't know if you want to, but
no,
it would be great.
Yeah,
because I remember all that I was going through at that moment. Yet you were put on blast with it, especially social media. And media itself, radio, and go ahead and share.
Well, yeah, I was. So there's a number of resettlement agencies here in the area, but for some reason I ended up being one of the primary default go-tos that local media would come to and be like, because the Syrian war and Syrian refugee crisis that was happening right at this time as the lead up to the election. You already have Trump talking about what he would do once elected, which, by the way, came from somewhere. And it came from the origins of his Muslim travel ban, actually came after comments from Franklin Graham. So Franklin Graham was the person who really started to tout it, because Trump is a very, in some ways, he seems like a bumbling idiot, but in other ways, he's a crafty authoritarian, right? He knows what to say to get a Pavlovian response from people who are trapped in fear and ignorance, so that they just flock to him and they see him as the answer, the solution,
like these
the
dog
strong,
whistles
the strong leader. But he took his cues with the evangelical community from evangelical leaders like Franklin Graham. So I'm doing lots of media pieces about how there are millions of people who are facing catastrophic violence and danger. We saw what was playing out in Europe with, refugees trying to flee physically across borders only to literally be kicked and for concertina wire to be constructed. And we saw all of that playing out. And I was trying to be a voice of saying, let's represent certain biblical teachings around honoring the sojourner, about standing with and supporting those who are oppressed. And it was difficult to be in that role, but then having these private conversations. And actually, the thing that really triggered it and triggered me being ostracized by the evangelical community really started with when Franklin Graham was announcing his bus tour. It was supposed to be like a prayer rally, but everybody knew it was not a prayer rally. It was a Republican voter turnout rally in prayer, with prayer being the cover. And he had already said some things that were really deeply upsetting, and that it's particularly amongst the Muslim community. And I remember having private conversations with respected leaders, the president at William Jessup University and other folks, and saying, we cannot just welcome him open arms and not expect for our opportunity to show love and compassion to local Muslim refugees who are finding their new home here in Sacramento without that being significantly damaged. And I started to call attention to that. And what I found was I got behind the scenes or behind closed doors affirmation of this is so spot on, Kirt. We need to follow this. This is great. And then as soon as I would walk away from those conversations, I was it was classic, because I remember having that conversation with Dr. John Jackson at William Jessup University and another person that we know here in the area, a private, it's like a closed door. And he was like, I'm going to call the major leaders together and we're going to talk about this because it's so spot on. And then literally nothing ever happened. Yeah. And in fact, quite the opposite. The university started to host shows, events that were sponsored by The Answer, which is a local. It's a local. What do they call that? radio. It's a local radio station that's a part of the Salem Communications Network. So if you're familiar with like in the evangelical world,
which I was
and radio,
a radio manager with Salem.
You know this.
Radio manager with Salem.
Salem and others like this. That was back. I mean, that was a part of the evangelical influence. It's like it's like Billy Graham getting on TV, right? Like let's use mass media to reclaim society and reclaim this country as a Christian nation. So I noticed that all of the conversations that I was having, the closed door conversations we're having, were being completely ignored. And then people just stopped even talking to me. Like it was really strange. Like people that I used to be able to text, I would text and nothing. It was very difficult. And that was one of the factors that led me to start to even question things at a deeper level. Like what's happening fundamentally at a psychological or philosophical level that's leading people to be drawn to this form of authoritarianism? And do I even have, do I even really agree with the fundamental underpinnings of this philosophical or spiritual belief system anymore?
Who interviewed you that time? Remember, it was with Salem, right? Because it was a complete setup.
You're right.
And but what was the whole point was because of what Trump was proposing, right?
Yes, yeah. Oh God.
Yeah, I don't know if you remember that. You do.
Know, but now I am. Like the trauma's coming back.
I know. I told you. I warned you before. I told them before we had the episode. I was like, I'm going to ask some questions that I know is probably going to bring some feelings back.
It's funny because you can find still a lot of these online. I found some interview somewhere, and it hasn't I haven't completely been expunged from the church record yet, I think. So I found an old sermon from another church nearby that's like posted on their YouTube page and things like that.
Yeah, I still got a lot of them out there too.
It was very clear that there was a high level of anxiety around these people coming to America and the effect that would have on our identity as a Christian nation, right? In even more unsettling conversations, you'll find conversations just around procreation, right? Where they're just like, we need to out baby each other.
Right.
And that's like, we need to out baby.
The talk of bad blood
or
contaminated lines and that sort of thing is becoming very, very
so if you have more children
difficult.
Or immigrants and then having too many babies,
and then you homeschool, as many of them are, you put them through Christian institutions, so that way they'll be brought up to defend the truth, right? That whole mindset that I just talked about previously that I left, then that's our solution to taking this country back, along with using every political, and now in some cases, even violence, if necessary, to reclaim institutions so that we can institute God's plan for the world.
Yeah. And it's such a rejection of the founders' concept of separation of church and state,
right.
the commitment to sort of a democracy that's tough to pull off. I grant it. It's already a difficult effort to try to give everyone a voice and everyone a vote and trust in that process, that majority rule, minority rights. All of that stuff is, difficult enough without this whole movement that calls all that into question, because we're Christians, we're white Christians, so we know best. We have God on our side, and we'll tell everyone. We need a system that allows us to tell everyone else how to think, how to behave, and what's permissible. Yeah. And so it's a very, very difficult. And when you go back and trace all that, I'm thinking, I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, oh, that's right. And then all of a sudden to today, where it seems like the whole thing has somehow been ignited to, all these smoldering sort of timbers, and then someone threw some gasoline onto it to where it's become this huge movement that is, by all interpretations, threatening the very fabric of who we are. Yeah. Now, maybe
in
maybe there's some
democracy.
changes we've needed for a long time, but I mean, that's the anxiety that people are feeling.
Yeah.
So catch us up to, like, you had mentioned a book that you read. What started this whole process of, hey, I'm being gaslit, I'm being, ignored, and so forth, so on. And that began a process for you that, we have a few minutes, and I'd love to take these last few minutes for you to just kind of share your process now of deconstructing, especially with Christian nationalism, and, how it's affected you, to even where you're at now, and what you're doing now. Yeah.
And what's interesting is I felt like even before kind of this rise of Christian nationalism in the kind of the Trumpian era of Christian nationalism, I was already having some serious questions with regards to my Christian identity and beliefs. As somebody who, by the time it was all said and done, I taught the Bible for about 25 years, and I was in professional ministry for 17. But for a good portion of that, I was becoming very unsettled with certain doctrines, particularly the doctrine of hell. And so some things I just didn't teach a whole lot on over time because I felt more and more unsettled by it. But as I got closer, and especially that last kind of the straw that broke the camel's back leading up to the election, I know that I certainly started to read and try to take in as much information and perspectives from others that, again, within the evangelical world, when you're used to a very controlled environment, just to start to hear other perspectives. I know that one of the books that was incredibly foundational for me in that early experience was a book called The Evangelicals, The Struggle to Shape America by Francis Fitzgerald, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author who wrote a book on the history of Vietnam. So she's just a historian. So it wasn't like coming at it with a hardcore agenda, but she talks about the history of evangelicalism and American politics. And that was a game changer for me to see that how much of my identity, how much of my beliefs and practices were now being explained not in spiritual terms, but from a sociological, historical, psychological perspective. I read books like The Body Keeps the Score and other things just that taught me about how to view things outside of that narrow framework that I used to have. So there was clearly a psychoeducation aspect of it, but there was also just connecting with people. I found a new family and friends. I appreciate it because Alex, and there was two other really still good friends of mine.
They got this fly around here.
Yeah, I know.
Get out of here.
Send them to me.
Yeah, now you got
spiritual. The people out there, hardcore evangelicals out there, it's like
they're
sending
this
spy to torment them.
Yeah,
but
the prayer answer to our prayers.
yeah. But Jonathan and Rula and Alex were like my only three former clergy friends who were like they were still for me. They felt like they were still for me. They still loved me. And they accepted me as I was, and as I was undertaking a very difficult journey. And honestly, my personal life had really kind of fallen apart as well. I needed to make some other big changes, which for me meant leaving a marriage. So talk about going through a lot of big transitions. I left a religion, left a profession, I left a relationship, all within a number of years. But one of probably the number one thing I would just say in terms of the community that I've connected with is I've connected with a lot of people who are practitioners in the space of working with individuals who are recovering from spiritual or religious trauma from high control, high demand groups. And I'm really excited because I'm actually, I got a passion project from a few years ago, connected with a couple of therapists, a good friend of mine's, Janice Selby and Jennifer French out of San Diego or LA area. And they are individuals who are have amazing vision around establishing a physical transitional living or recovery center for people who are coming out of high demand, high control religious environments or cults. And so that is like the number one thing that I'm doing now, outside of continuing to read my own personal therapy. There was a model that was very helpful to me called Internal Family Systems. It's a psychological therapeutic model that I did a deep dive into to help me deconstruct quite a bit. And then I think outside of all of that, I just try to continue to use my voice, however I can, and in whatever way it might be helpful to others. So I've connected with another organization a couple of years ago, early on, called the Clergy Project. This is all for former clergy who are now atheists and in that kind of camp, former or current, but who are secretly, because I've started to connect with individuals who are still active clergy who are like, this isn't me anymore, but they don't know how to make that transition. So it's kind of a combination of just my own care. I have a beautiful now fiance of was that 3 weeks ago? So connected with another beautiful human who is on her own journey of recovery. And so growing in that relationship, continue to learn, and then doing something with this new knowledge and passion that I have for helping individuals recover from religious trauma.
Yeah, and it would be good to have Kirt come back sometime and just talk about that community, some of those therapies, because there are a lot of people recovering from or deconstructing from these controlled systems, like cultic systems, and need some support because it's very traumatic. It's very difficult, and so to know that there are some places out there that people can go, that is a huge benefit. And so maybe we can have you back sometime to talk a little bit more about that group, that community, that process, in terms of helping people.
Can you at least repeat some of those resources for our listeners?
That'd be great.
Yeah, so that way they can know what you're doing, what you're involved in, and how they can, get the help that they need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of, like with my friend, Janice Selby, her divorcing religion workshops are really fantastic. I would say that there's a lot of, I wish I had it like top of mind right now. Of course, it's failing me. But there's a lot of organizations that you'll find kind of under the hashtag of ex-evangelicals or empty the pews. You'll find conversations that are happening in the social blogosphere, whatever.
Yeah.
In that domain. But recovery from religion, that's another great initial source to connect with. You'll find their website, you find their those social media.
And then you mentioned the clergy one too.
And the Clergy Project. If you are active clergy and you're deconstructing and you're going through crisis, highly recommend you look up the Clergy Project. And I love connecting with people as well. So if you want to connect with me, you want to hear a little bit more about some of my thoughts and journey, you can either visit my blog. I'm trying to live stream on a regular basis on YouTube and Instagram, and have some conversations there as well.
That's great. Thank you.
Well, Kirt, it was good having you, man.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I like what you said about, losing a lot of these relationships, but yet there was still some left, in the sense of like you and I being friends, going through this experience. For me, it's helped me a lot, having you as a friend, having Jonathan and Rula, and going through this process. And sometimes it's hard to share with people that, now we're becoming more and more, I'm becoming more and more involved with, mainliners, people that, understand the scriptures in a different light and, understand things very differently than how I was raised, to help them understand what it is to deconstruct from that. It's difficult because, some of them don't ever even feel the need to deconstruct where they're at. Not to say that there hasn't been people that has deconstructed from their side too. So, but it's much more common from, where we came from, the evangelical, perspective, because it's just like what you were talking about, so controlled, so dogmatic, so fundamental, so limited. But I'm just so glad that, you had a chance to be with us. And like Bob said, we'd love to have you back and talk about, resources, talk about, ways people get to a point of where they're healing up from this, because it's difficult. It's a hard journey.
I was gonna say, the good thing about this happening in a much more escalated sense in our day with this election coming up, it feels like more people now finally are sort of paying attention to the dangers of Christian nationalism and conservative evangelicalism and some of these teachings that are very cult-like, that dismiss people, that have categories of people, acceptable people, non-acceptable, and the way in which that has threatened the very fabric of democracy. It always was threatening it, even back into the 70s and before. But now, because of this rise in it makes me nervous, because now they're, that group getting power will really mean some challenges for our country, going forward. But even if they don't, and let's say Trump loses the election in November, then it's going to be, the work is still going to be there. The effort, because the nationalists, the Christian nationalists, aren't going to all of a sudden go away and say, oh, I guess we were wrong. But there's so many more people talking about it, writing about it. And that's comforting, because I feel like we need a response. But so far up to now, it's been sort of quiet a little bit in the background, but now it's not in the background anymore.
And some would argue, and I would probably be amongst that camp, that what we have in our existing parties is hardcore Christian nationalism and softcore Christian nationalism. So it's still there. It's still a Christian nationalistic colonial exercise.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's what's that question is kind of like what will happen in the short term, but there's still a lot of skeletons in the closet to explore that we see, and a number of other issues in which, for example, there still is a strong adherence or catering to Christian nationalism amongst people in the Democratic Party as it relates to foreign policy and other issues.
That American superiority.
That America first.
American superiority, Christian first, Christian superiority. Yep. These kinds of attitudes are still, those are the things that we need to deconstruct from. Right. And a lot of people who aren't ready to do that. So maybe the challenge, as these things are opened up, maybe it will take us down some roads that will make a lot of corrections within our psyche as a country and Christianity.
So Kirt, I'm going to pull a Bob.
Okay.
And what he did 2 weeks ago, I think it was, who do you think's going to win?
Yeah. Prediction.
Give your predictions. Or how do you feel about what's going on with the elections?
I feel that I'm one of those people that feels like either way we're losing.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned before, I'm deeply, as somebody who is a combat veteran who then also worked for the better part of a decade with individuals and families who fled war and violence, and who has experienced some aspects of the pain and suffering, just observing it and listening and learning. I still feel like we tend to think in our own American myopic way that we think about ourselves. I think in terms of what's happening in the world, what's happening, for example, in Gaza and Lebanon now and other parts of the world is going to continue to lose without America going through a wholesale radical transformation. And I think a big part of that will be our collective deconstruction from Christian colonialism. I would just say that I don't, yes, I certainly align on some other issues more with the Democratic platform, but it feels like in many ways in some of the most important issues of just like not committing genocide and other things, it feels like a losing battle for a good number of us, no matter what. And that's just from the standpoint of hoping to be an ally with those who are suffering, not being somebody who's suffering himself, because at the end of the day, I'm a white male, formerly Christian white male. You don't get much more privileged in Western society than that. So I hate to end on that kind of a note, but I don't know how it's going to turn out. And I just feel like either way,
we have work to do.
It's going to be hard.
Yeah. Thanks for speaking, your mind, your heart. We really appreciate that.
Coming.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Definitely.
Nice to meet you.
All right. Well, this is an episode that's going to be out there. We're ramping up to the elections, so we're getting ready for it.
Yeah, stay tuned. We'll keep going on this topic for the month.
Definitely. All right. Well, as Bob said, stay tuned. Until next time, take care.